Danny Martinez ran through the tall grass near the edge of New Haven Colony, his laughter carrying across the open fields where his mother worked with the other farmers and settlers who had made this world their home just 3 years ago. And the 7-year-old boy had no idea that this perfect afternoon would be the last normal moment of his childhood, or that his name would soon be known across the entire galaxy as the spark that changed everything between humans and the stars. The colony sat on a peaceful world at the edge of explored space, far from Earth, but close enough to other settlements that the colonists felt relatively safe from the dangers that lurked in the dark between worlds. And Lisa Martinez watched her son play while she calibrated soil sensors, grateful for the simple life they had built hereafter, leaving the crowded cities of Earth behind for something better and cleaner. And full of hope, Captain Ryan Fletcher stood in the security station at the colony center, reviewing the daily reports that showed nothing unusual. Just another quiet day on New Haven, where the biggest threat was usually crop disease or equipment failure. Not the kind of dangers that required the weapons he kept locked in the armory for emergencies that never seemed to come. And he allowed himself to relax just a little as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon high above the planet. Commander Kyle Harrison reviewed star charts aboard the defense frigate Defender, one of Earth's newer vessels assigned to protect the outer colonies from pirates and raiders, who occasionally ventured into human space looking for easy targets. And he felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with knowing hundreds of lives depended on his crew staying alert and ready. Even when weeks could pass without anything more exciting than a merchant ship requesting navigation assistance, the Vrix attack came without warning. 3 ships dropped out of hyperspace directly above New Haven, their weapons already charged and their boarding parties ready to move the moment they entered atmosphere. And the reptilian slavers had done this hundreds of times before with dozens of species across the galaxy, confident that the new human settlement would be just another quick raid that would net them valuable cargo to sell in the lawless sectors where no one asked questions about where merchandise came from. Danny heard the screaming first, then saw the dark shapes descending from the sky on columns of fire that scorched the grass and sent animals fleeing in terror. And his 7-year-old mind couldn't process what he was seeing because nothing in his short life had prepared him for armored aliens bursting from landing craft with weapons that crackled with deadly energy. Lisa dropped her equipment and ran toward her son, her heart pounding with fear that overwhelmed every other thought. But the Vrix were faster and more experienced at this terrible work, and she watched in helpless horror as scaled hands grabbed Danny and 2 other children playing nearby, hauling them toward the waiting ships while parents screamed and colonists scrambled for weapons they had never expected to actually meet Ryan. Fletcher burst from the security station with every weapon he could carry. But he was one man against a coordinated military operation, and the Vrix had been raiding settlements for centuries while humans had been in space for less than 50 years, barely long enough to establish a handful of colonies beyond their own solar system. And the slavers viewed them as insignificant newcomers who would learn the hard lessons that all weak species eventually learned. The Vrix commander, Scarl, watched the operation unfold from his ship's bridge, satisfied with the efficiency of his crew as they loaded cargo holds with captives from multiple species, including these humans who looked soft and weak compared to the hardened warriors his people produced. And he had conducted over 200 raids in his career without serious resistance, because everyone knew that fighting the Vrix only led to more pain and suffering. Danny struggled against the arms holding him, crying for his mother as the alien ship's interior swallowed him in cold metal and harsh lights that hurt his eyes. And he saw other children from the colony along with adults he didn't recognize from species he had only seen in school lessons about the galactic community. That suddenly seemed much more frightening than any teacher had explained, Kyle Harrison received the distress signal 17 minutes after the attack began, his blood turning to ice as he read the report from New Haven, and he immediately ordered his ship to maximum speed while sending urgent messages to Earth Command and every human vessel within range. Knowing that every second counted, but feeling the terrible weight of being too far away to help, Lisa Martinez stood in the trampled grass where her son had been playing, her hands shaking and her mind refusing to accept what had just happened, while other parents collapsed in grief and rage around her, and Captain Fletcher tried to coordinate a response even as the Vrick ships accelerated toward the edge of the system and the safety of hyperspace, where no one could follow without knowing their exact destination. The slavers jumped to faster than light travel 31 minutes after arriving, their holds full of captives and their commander already calculating profits from the sale of so many young specimens. And Scarl allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at another successful operation before turning his attention to the next target on his list, completely unaware that he had just made the worst mistake of his long career. Ryan Fletcher sent the distress call to Earth with full details of the attack, including visual recordings from the settlement's security systems and the terrified testimony of witnesses who had watched their children disappear into alien ships. And he included one more thing in his report that would prove prophetic in the days to come. The Vricks have no idea what they just started. The message reached Earth's government within hours. And what the Vricks didn't understand about humans was about to become painfully clear to them and to the entire galaxy. Because while other species had learned to accept losses and negotiate ransoms and move on with their lives after such tragedies, humans had a different response programmed into their DNA by millions of years of evolution, protecting their young at any costing the galactic community. The Council of Aligned Worlds received notification of the raid, as they did for dozens of similar incidents each year, and they prepared their standard response of diplomatic condemnation and offers to mediate ransom negotiations, because that was how civilized species handled such unfortunate events in a galaxy too large for anyone government to police effectively. Ambassador Lauren Hayes sat in the council chambers on the neutral station that served as the galactic government's seat of power, listening to the Torvian representative explain why military action against the Vricks would be inappropriate and counterproductive. And she felt a cold rage building in her chest that she kept carefully hidden behind a professional diplomat's mask back on New Haven. Lisa Martinez made a decision that would echo across the stars, refusing to wait for governments and councils and negotiations that might take months or years, while her son suffered in the hands of slavers. And she gathered other parents and former soldiers and anyone with the courage to fight, determined to take action, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had. The Defender raced toward New Haven at maximum speed, Kyle Harrison pushing his engines beyond safe limits because regulations meant nothing when children were in danger. And his crew worked with grim determination to prepare for a rescue mission that would violate every treaty and protocol in the book. And none of them cared about the consequences. Danny Martinez huddled with the other captive children in the cold cargo hold of Scarl's ship, trying to be brave like his mother had always taught him, unaware that his kidnapping had just united humanity in a way nothing else ever had, and that across human space, from Earth to the furthest colonies, a single message was spreading like wildfire: bring the children home, whatever it takes. The news reached Earth Command at 0342 hours Greenwich Mean Time, and Admiral Kevin Brooks read the report 3 times before the full horror of it sank into his mind. Knowing that 4 human children had been taken by slavers and that every parent on Earth would be watching to see how their government responded. And within the hour, the president had convened an emergency session with military commanders and civilian leaders who all arrived with the same grim expression that said everything needed to be said. Without words, the debate lasted less than 20 minutes. Because there was no real debate to be had. Just politicians and generals agreeing on what everyone already knew in their bones. That humanity would not negotiate or wait or follow the careful protocols that other species used when facing such tragedies. And the order went out to every human vessel in space and every military installation across 36 worlds. Find the children and bring them home, Lieutenant Nicole. Stevens worked in the intelligence division on Europa Station. Her specialty being the tracking and analysis of ship movements through the maze of hyperspace lanes that connected the galaxy. And she assembled her team within an hour of receiving the priority alert. Knowing that finding 4 children in a galaxy of trillions would require every skill and resource they possessed. And knowing that failure was not an option that anyone would accept, the Galactic Council sent their official response to Earth's ambassador, expressing sympathy for the colony's loss and offering to open diplomatic channels with the Vrix to negotiate for the captives' release. And they included the standard warnings, a proportional response, and the importance of maintaining peaceful relations with all species. Even criminal ones who operated in the lawless sectors beyond Council jurisdiction. Ambassador Lauren Hayes received the message while sitting in her quarters aboard the diplomatic station, and she felt something cold and hard settle into her chest as she read the Council's careful words that basically told humanity to accept this violation and move on like civilized people were supposed to do. And she knew that the Council was about to learn something about humans that would shake their comfortable assumptions about how species were supposed to behave. She called for a formal session of the Council within 6 hours, using emergency protocols that couldn't be denied. And when the representatives from 47 different species gathered in the Great Chamber, she stood before them in her dark suit with Earth's flag behind her and delivered humanity's ultimatum in a voice that never wavered. Return the children within 72 hours or face the consequences. The Torvian representative actually laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. And he explained in his condescending way that new species always made these dramatic threats when they first encountered the harsh realities of galactic life. But they always learned to be reasonable once they understood how much they had to lose by making enemies of powerful factions like the Vrix and their allies in the criminal underworld. Lauren looked at the Torvian with eyes that had gone flat and cold. And she spoke words that would be quoted in history books for generations to come. You think we're bluffing because you don't understand us yet. But you will, because we're not negotiating and we're not asking permission. We're telling you what's going to happen. And if you want to sanction us or condemn us or try to stop us, then you go right ahead and see what happens when you stand between humans and their children. The council chamber fell silent, and several representatives exchanged worried glances because they had never heard a diplomat speak with such raw certainty before. And they began to wonder if perhaps these humans were actually serious about starting a war over 4 children out of trillions of beings in the galaxy back on New Haven. Lisa Martinez stood in the colony's small hangar bay with 19 other volunteers. Most of them parents, but some just colonists who couldn't stand by and do nothing. And they loaded weapons and supplies onto 3 civilian ships that were designed for cargo transport, not combat. But that would have to be enough, because waiting for the military to arrive would take too long and every hour. Mattered Captain Ryan Fletcher tried one last time to convince them to wait for proper support. But he saw the determination in their eyes and knew that nothing he said would change their minds. So instead, he gave them everything the colony could spare: weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and the coordinates of every informant and contact he had cultivated during his years in security work. Lisa checked her rifle one more time, her hand steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her whenever she thought about Danny scared and alone in an alien ship. And she pushed those thoughts away because fear was useless right now, and rage was much more productive. The kind of cold rage that would let her do whatever needed to be done to get her son back. The Defender arrived at New Haven 43 hours after the attack. Kyle Harrison's ship scorched and strained from the hard burn across interstellar space. And he found the colonists already organized and armed, with 3 civilian ships ready to depart on their own rescue mission that had no official authorization and no real chance of success. But that would happen anyway, because humans apparently didn't care about odds when their children were involved. Kyle called a meeting with the colonist volunteers and explained the tactical situation in blunt terms. The Vrix operated from a stronghold in the Corvin Nebula, a region where sensor interference made tracking almost impossible, and where their forces included at least 12 warships that outgunned his entire task force. And any rescue attempt would be suicide by conventional military standards. Lisa Martinez looked at the commander and asked a simple question: "Are you coming with us or not?" Kyle studied the determined faces around him and made a decision that would end his career or make him a hero, possibly both. And he answered with equal simplicity: "We're coming with you, all of us. Because orders and regulations don't mean a damn thing right now." Lieutenant Stevens worked through the night, analyzing shipping records and communication intercepts, her team pulling data from every source they could access legally or otherwise. And they built a picture of the Vrix operation that revealed something interesting. The slavers were arrogant and careless because no one had seriously challenged them in decades. And that carelessness left traces that human intelligence systems could follow. The breakthrough came when a junior analyst noticed a pattern in fuel purchases at stations near the Corvin Nebula. And Stevens realized they could narrow down the Vrix location to a relatively small area of space. Maybe only a few hundred cubic light years instead of thousands. And she sent the data to Kyle Harrison with a note that said, "It's not much, but it's what we have. Go get them." Admiral Brooks deployed additional forces to support the rescue mission. But he knew they were weeks away from reaching the Corvin Nebula. And by the time they arrived, the situation would likely be resolved one way or another. So he gave Kyle operational command and told him to do whatever was necessary. And that if things went badly, the Admiral would take full responsibility for the unauthorized military action. The media across human space broadcast constant updates on the kidnapping, and millions of people watched and waited with a collective anxiety that transcended politics and nationality and every other division that normally separated humans into competing groups. Because those 4 children represented something fundamental that united everyone: the absolute requirement to protect the young. No matter what it cost, Danny Martinez tried to keep track of time in the cargo hold. But the artificial lighting never changed, and the Vrix guards fed them at irregular intervals. And he found himself becoming the strong one for the younger children who cried for their parents, telling them stories about Earth and New Haven and promising them that someone would come for them, even though he had no idea if that was true. Megan Cooper was the oldest captive at 10 years old. And she watched the Vrix guards carefully during their infrequent visits to the cargo hold, noting how they were casual and inattentive because they viewed the prisoners as simple cargo that required minimal supervision. And she began forming a plan in her mind that was probably crazy, but might work if the opportunity arose. The Galactic Council sent increasingly stern warnings to Earth, threatening economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation if humanity pursued military action against the Vrix. And they lectured Ambassador Hayes about the importance of proportional response and civilized behavior, apparently expecting humans to value abstract concepts like galactic harmony more than the lives of their children. Lauren listened to their speeches and their threats with growing contempt for the bureaucratic cowardice that let slavers operate freely while condemning those who would fight back. And she responded with a message that bypassed all diplomatic protocol: "We don't care. Sanction us if you want, isolate us if you must. But understand that we will burn down the galaxy before we abandon our children to slavers. Lisa Martinez sat in the pilot's seat of her ship as the small fleet prepared to depart New Haven. And she thought about all the ways this could go wrong and all the reasons why charging into the Corvin Nebula was tactical insanity. But then she thought about Danny's laugh and his smile and the way he trusted her to keep him safe, and she engaged the Corvin Nebula stretched across 3 light years of space, its swirling clouds of gas and dust creating electromagnetic interference that made conventional sensors nearly useless. And for centuries, it had served as the perfect hiding place for criminals and pirates who needed a safe harbor beyond the reach of galactic law enforcement. And Commander Scarl felt completely secure as his ships approached the hidden station that served as the Vrix stronghold in this sector. Danny Martinez sat quietly in the corner of the cargo hold, his arm around a younger girl named Sophie, who couldn't stop crying for her mother. And he whispered reassurances he didn't really believe while watching Megan Cooper move around the hold with careful deliberation, picking up discarded pieces of equipment and studying the door mechanism with the intense focus of someone planning something important. The Vrix guards laughed among themselves during their shift change, discussing how much profit they would make from this haul and placing bets on which captives would sell for the highest prices. And they barely glanced at the human children huddled in the corner, because what threat could children possibly pose to armed warriors from a species that had been raiding and conquering for thousands of years? Lieutenant Nicole Stevens sent her final data package to Kyle Harrison's fleet, the information representing 72 hours of non-stop work by her entire team. And the breakthrough had come from an unexpected source: human sensor technology developed for navigating Earth's complex magnetic fields could partially penetrate the nebula's interference, giving them an advantage that no other species possessed. Lisa Martinez piloted her ship into the nebula's outer edges, a civilian vessel equipped with mining scanners that had been hastily modified to map the region's topology. And behind her flew 2 more colonist ships crewed by parents and volunteers who had left behind jobs and families and safety to venture into one of the most dangerous regions in known space. Armed with nothing but determination and desperate love, the human military task force followed at a distance, Kyle Harrison coordinating with the civilian vessels while maintaining communications, silenced to avoid alerting the Vrix to their presence. And his tactical officer, Lieutenant Jacob Wells, worked to compile the scattered sensor data into a coherent picture of the nebula's interior and the enemy forces waiting there. Commander Scarl reviewed the latest intelligence reports from his network of informants, noting that the Galactic Council had condemned the raid on New Haven and that human diplomats were making angry speeches. And he felt amused rather than concerned, because new species always reacted emotionally at first before learning to accept the realities of galactic life. The Vrix station hung in the heart of the nebula, a massive structure that served as warehouse, fortress, and slave market combined. And its defensive fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers that could obliterate any force foolish enough to attack, plus automated weapon platforms scattered throughout the nearby space that would trigger alerts if any ships approached without proper authorization codes. Megan Cooper had been observing the guards for days now, learning their routines and their casual arrogance. And she noticed that they always left the cargo hold door partially unsealed during shift changes, because it made their jobs easier when they didn't have to wait for the full security cycle. And she filed that information away for when the moment came to use it. Kyle Harrison's ships penetrated deeper into the nebula using the modified sensor data from Nicole Stevens, their path carefully calculated to avoid the known patrol routes that the Vrix followed with predictable regularity. And the human crews maintained strict emissions control to minimize their electronic signature against the Nebula's background noise, Lisa Martinez made contact with the military fleet through tight beam communication. And Kyle Harrison found himself in the strange position of coordinating strategy with civilian volunteers who had no tactical training but possessed something equally valuable: the absolute refusal to consider failure as a possible outcome. They developed a plan that was audacious to the point of insanity, relying on the Vrick's assumption that humans would either not come at all or would approach with overwhelming force in a conventional military operation. And the fact that 3 civilian ships were approaching the station requesting emergency assistance would hopefully appear routine enough to avoid triggering immediate defensive responses. The colonist vessels altered their transponders to appear as independent traders whose navigation systems had failed in the nebula's interference. A common enough occurrence that the Vrick station received such requests several times per month. And Lisa Martinez broadcast a distress call in standard galactic trade language while her crew concealed weapons in shielded cargo containers that would pass most routine scans. Commander Scar received the distress call and saw an opportunity for additional profit, because disabled traders usually carried valuable cargo that could be seized with minimal effort. And he ordered his docking control to allow the human ships to approach while alerting his boarding teams to prepare for a quick and profitable robbery. Danny heard new sounds filtering through the cargo hold walls, the thrumming of engines and the clang of metal against metal that suggested activity beyond their prison. And he held Sophie tighter while catching Megan's eye across the hold, seeing something fierce and determined in her expression that gave him a tiny spark of hope. The civilian ships docked with the Vrick station according to the coordinates provided by the arrogant dockmaster, who had no idea that he was inviting death aboard his facility. And the moment the airlocks connected and pressurized, Lisa Martinez gave the signal that would begin either a desperate rescue or a heroic last stand. The disabled traders poured into the station with weapons blazing. Colonists who had trained as soldiers decades ago, moving with muscle memory that never fully faded. And they caught the Vrick's boarding teams completely by surprise, because no one expected prey to transform into predators so quickly simultaneously. Kyle Harrison dropped all pretense of stealth and brought his task force out of the nebula's deepest shadows with weapons hot and targeting solutions locked onto the Vrick's defensive fleet. And his opening salvo caught 3 enemy cruisers before they could raise shields, because they had been expecting merchants, not warships. The Vrick's fleet scrambled to respond, their captains shouting orders in confusion and alarm as human frigates attacked with suicidal aggression that defied all conventional tactical doctrine. And the space around the station erupted into a brutal close-range battle that favored desperate courage over technological superiority inside the station. Lisa Martinez led her team through corridors slick with atmosphere leaks and emergency lighting, following the intelligence data that Nicole Stevens had compiled about the station's layout. And behind her came parents who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The Vrick's guards finally realized they were under serious attack rather than dealing with a random incident. And they organized defensive positions with the trained efficiency of professional soldiers. But they had never faced enemies who fought like wounded animals protecting their young. And the sheer ferocity of the human assault overwhelmed their prepared positions. Commander Scarl watched his carefully organized operation fall apart in real time, his tactical displays showing human ships that should have been destroyed instead, ramming his cruisers when their weapons failed. And he began to understand that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment about these new species, who apparently didn't care about their own survival when their children were threatened. Kyle Harrison's frigate Defender took heavy damage from a Vrick's cruiser's main cannon, the shot punching through his forward shields and vaporizing the navigation section. But he ordered his helmsman to maintain attack course while damage control teams fought fires and sealed hull breaches. Because retreat wasn't an option when children needed rescue, Megan Cooper heard the sounds of battle growing closer to the cargo hold. The distinctive crack of human weapons mixing with the Vrick's energy discharge that made a sound like tearing fabric. And she gathered the younger children near the door while preparing to execute the desperate plan she had been forming. The firefight reached the corridor outside the hold, and Lisa Martinez saw the sealed door that separated her from her son. Just 20 meters ahead, but guarded by 6 Vrick's warriors who had established a fortified position with overlapping fields of fire. Captain Ryan Fletcher moved up beside Lisa with his rifle ready. The old soldier in him recognizing the tactical impossibility of charging that position without devastating casualties. But the human in him also recognizing that sometimes the impossible had to be attempted anyway. Megan lit the small fire she had prepared using materials scrounged from the hold over days of careful planning, creating just enough smoke and heat to trigger the environmental sensors that would force the guards to partially open the door to prevent the captives from suffocating before they could be sold. The door slid open 10 centimeters, and that narrow gap was all the humans needed. Lisa and her team pouring fire through the opening while the Vrick's guards scrambled to respond to the unexpected threat from inside the hold. And in the chaos of that moment, the tide of battle shifted. Danny saw his mother's face appear in the widening door. Lisa Martinez scooped Danny into her arms, while her team provided covering fire against the remaining Vrick's guards. Her wounded shoulder screaming in pain, but her grip on her son never wavering. And she felt a surge of triumph mixed with relief that threatened to overwhelm her focus just when she needed it most. Danny buried his face in his mother's neck and felt her heartbeat racing against his cheek. And he knew without being told that getting out of the station would be just as dangerous as getting in had been. But none of that mattered because his mother had come for him just like he knew she would. Megan Cooper helped the younger children stay together as the rescue team fought their way back toward the docking bay. Her 10-year-old mind processing the violence around her with a clarity that would probably cause nightmares later. But right now she just focused on keeping Sophie and the others moving forward through the smoke and chaos. Captain Ryan Fletcher moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this kind of work before in another life. His rifle finding targets with mechanical precision while he directed the retreat through the station's maze of corridors. And he felt a grim satisfaction that his old skills were still sharp. When they needed to, Betty Vrick's mounted a desperate counterattack. Commander Skull having ordered every available warrior to converge on the cargo section to prevent the humans from escaping with their prizes. And his troops responded with professional discipline despite their shock at facing enemies who fought with such ferocious determination. Kyle Harrison watched the tactical display as 2 of his frigates engaged 4 Vrick's cruisers at point-blank range. The battle having devolved into the kind of brutal slugging match where victory went to whoever could absorb more punishment. And his own ship shuddered under repeated hits that were slowly overwhelming the defender's shields, and Honor Lieutenant Jacob Wells reported critical damage to the engine room and weapons batteries. But Kyle ordered all remaining power diverted to the forward guns because pulling back now would mean abandoning the rescue team inside the station. And he would rather die fighting than live with that failure. The colonist ships at the docking bay came under heavy fire from station defensive systems, automated weapons that had been programmed to prevent unauthorized departures. And the civilian crews fired back with everything they had while desperately trying to keep the airlocks open for the rescue team that was fighting its way through the station. Lisa's team burst into the docking bay with Vrick's warriors close behind. A running gun battle that left several colonists wounded and at least 3 Vrick's dead in the corridors. Then she practically threw Danny through the airlock before turning to provide covering fire while the rest of the children scrambled to safety. Ryan Fletcher was the last one through, his left leg bleeding from a glancing energy blast. and he slapped the emergency release that sealed the airlock just as Rick's troops reached the bay entrance. Their weapons scoring the hull but failing to prevent the separation, the civilian ship undocked with violent speed, its pilot executing an emergency burn that slammed everyone against the walls with crushing force. And Lisa held Danny tight while the vessel shook and rattled under defensive fire from the station's automated systems. Kyle Harrison saw the civilian ships clearing the station and knew that his job now was to cover their escape, which meant keeping the Vrix fleet occupied for as long as possible, even if it cost him his entire task force. And he ordered his ships to press the attack with everything they had left. The Defender's main gun fired one last devastating salvo that crippled a Vrix cruiser's reactor, and Kyle felt a moment of savage joy before his own ship took a direct hit that sheared off the entire port side and sent the frigate spinning into the nebulous depths with half the crew dead and the survivors fighting for their lives. Commander Scarl watched his operation collapse around him, the human fleet proving far more resilient than their small numbers suggested. And he finally gave the order he never thought he would have to issue: abandon the station and retreat to the secondary base in the outer reaches. But the humans had anticipated that move as well, and 3 more human warships dropped out of hyperspace directly in the Vrix retreat path. Fresh vessels that had been held in reserve for exactly this moment. And the trap closed around Scarl's fleet with brutal efficiency. The space battle lasted another 17 minutes before the remaining Vrix ships surrendered or scattered into the nebulous depths, leaving the station damaged but under human control. And Kyle Harrison's executive officer managed to stabilize the Defender long enough for rescue shuttles to evacuate the surviving crew. Lisa Martinez sat in the medical bay of her ship, holding Danny while a medic worked on her shoulder, and she watched the other parents reunite with their children with tears streaming down her face. And she understood on a fundamental level that they had just changed everything about how humans would be perceived in the galaxy. The casualties were counted as the human ships regrouped around the captured station. 2 frigates destroyed with all hands, 112 dead across the fleet, and 37 wounded, including Kyle Harrison himself, who had taken shrapnel to his chest when the Defender's bridge exploded. But every single child was coming home alive, along with captives from 6 other species who had been scheduled for sale in the slave markets. And that fact made the price seem almost bearable to the humans who had paid it. Megan Cooper sat with the younger children in the civilian ship's cargo bay that had been converted to a temporary shelter, telling them stories to keep their minds off the battle still raging outside. And she felt older than her 10 years as she processed what they had all been through. Commander Scarl was captured when his flagship's engines failed and human Marines boarded the crippled vessel, and he found himself in shackles for the first time in his long career, facing the very real possibility that he would spend the rest of his life in a human prison, paying for his arrogance. The news of the successful rescue reached Earth within hours, and the celebrations that erupted across human space were tempered by grief for those who had died making it possible. And memorial services were planned while politicians and military leaders tried to process what had just happened. Ambassador Lauren Hayes received word of the rescue while still in the Galactic Council chambers, and she saw the shocked expressions on the faces of representatives who had assured her that military action against the Vrix was futile. And she allowed herself a small smile before delivering her next message. The Torvian representative who had laughed at Earth's ultimatum sat in stunned silence as Hayes displayed footage from the battle, showing human ships fighting with a ferocity that made seasoned warriors uncomfortable. And she could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about this new species. Other species on the council began whispering among themselves, some in admiration and others in fear. because the humans had just demonstrated that they were willing to violate treaties and risk economic sanctions and fight impossible battles when their core values were threatened. And that made them unpredictable and dangerous in ways the galaxy hadn't seen in centuries. Civilian ships carrying the rescued children jumped to hyperspace under military escort, beginning the long journey back to New Haven, where families waited with desperate hope. And Lisa Martinez finally allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was over. Kyle Harrison was transferred to a medical ship. His injury serious but not life-threatening, and he learned that he was being simultaneously recommended for the highest military honors and facing a court-martial for unauthorized military action. And he found that he didn't care about either because the mission had succeeded. Danny Martinez fell asleep in his mother's arms, his dreams troubled by memories of cold cargo holds and alien voices, but anchored by the solid reality of being safe and protected and loved. And he would carry the scars of his ordeal for the rest of his life, but also the knowledge that his people would move heaven and earth to bring him home. Captain Ryan Fletcher coordinated the security detail aboard the civilian ships, his wounded leg bandaged but still functional, and he mentally prepared his after-action report, knowing that it would be studied and debated for years to come as an example of what humans were capable of when properly motivated. The word spread through the criminal underworld faster than light-speed communication, whispered in the dark corners of lawless stations and pirate havens, that the Vrix had kidnapped human children and paid a terrible price, and that anyone who made the same mistake should expect the same response. Commander Scarl sat in his cell aboard the human flagship and contemplated how completely he had misunderstood these newcomers to the galactic stage. And he realized too late that humans had a different calculus about acceptable costs when protecting their young. And that understanding would have saved him everything if it had come sooner. The human fleet began the journey home, their ships battered and their crews exhausted. But they carried with them proof that determination and courage could overcome superior numbers and technology when the cause was just. And that lesson would reshape the galaxy's perception of humanity forever. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace above New Haven 3 weeks after the raid that had started everything. And the entire colony gathered at the landing field to watch the ships descend through the atmosphere with their precious cargo. And Lisa Martinez held Danny's hand as their vessel touched down on soil that suddenly felt more like home than it ever had before. Reunion was overwhelming and chaotic and beautiful. Parents embracing children while the entire colony celebrated their return. And medical teams moved through the crowd checking the rescued children for injuries while trying not to interfere with the emotional healing that was already beginning. Danny Martinez would need counseling and time to process his trauma, and the nightmares would probably continue for months or even years. But he was home and safe, and surrounded by people who loved him enough to risk everything for his return. And that knowledge would be the foundation on which he rebuilt his sense of security. Admiral Kevin Brooks stood before the Galactic Council of Aligned Worlds 6 days after the rescue, invited to explain Earth's actions in what was clearly intended to be a formal censure. And he wore his full-dress uniform with the medals he had earned in previous conflicts and the new scars he had earned from watching good people die for a cause he completely believed in. Ambassador Lauren Hayes sat beside the Admiral, her diplomatic credentials temporarily suspended pending review of her inflammatory statements to the Council, and she showed no sign of regret or apology as the various representatives took turns condemning humanity's reckless military action. The Torvian representatives spoke at length about treaty violations and the dangerous precedent set by Earth's unilateral attack on the Vrix, and he warned that such behavior would not be tolerated in a civilized galactic community that valued peaceful resolution of conflicts. and his voice held the confident certainty of someone who believed the galaxy would unite. Against this aggressive new species, Admiral Brooks waited patiently for the speeches to end. And when his turn came to respond, he activated a holographic display that showed footage from the rescue operation, including the terrified faces of children in cargo holds and the desperate fight to free them. And he let the images speak for themselves for a full minute before beginning his statement. "You call us reckless," he said in a calm voice that carried across the chamber. "And you warn us about proportional response and civilized behavior. And you seem to think we should apologize for violating your comfortable rules. But let me be very clear about something you need to understand about humans." The council chamber fell silent. All 47 species representatives watching this human military commander who looked at them without fear or deference. And Brooks continued with the same steady tone that made his words more powerful than any shouting could have been. "We are willing to negotiate on almost everything. We can compromise on trade and territory and political disagreements. We will follow your rules when they make sense and work within your systems when possible. But there are some lines that cannot be crossed, some values that are not negotiable. And the safety of our children is one of those absolute limits." He paused to let that sink in, then activated another display showing the casualty list from the rescue operation. 112 names with photos and brief biographies. And he made sure every representative could see the faces of those who had paid the ultimate price. These people died so that 4 children could come home. And if you think that price was too high, then you fundamentally misunderstand who we are. Because every human who served in that operation volunteered knowing the odds. And thousands more were ready to join if needed. And millions more supported the mission, even knowing it might cost them everything. The Torvian tried to interrupt, but Brooks raised his hand and continued without acknowledging the attempted disruption. And his voice took on an edge that made several representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You can sanction us if you want. You can isolate us diplomatically. You can make your stern speeches about how disappointed you are in our behavior. But understand this. If you or anyone else comes for our children, we will respond exactly the same way. And no amount of political pressure will change that fundamental truth." Ambassador Hayes stood and activated her own display, showing footage from the liberated Vrick station, including cells full of captives from multiple species who had been waiting to be sold into slavery. And her voice was cold as she addressed the council. "While you were debating proper procedures and proportional responses, we were actually doing something about a criminal operation that you have allowed to exist for decades. And we freed not just our own children, but captives from 6 other species, including 2 from the Torvian Confederation." She looked directly at the Torvian representative who had been so confident in his condemnation. And she delivered her next words with surgical precision designed to cut through his moral superiority. "So before you lecture us about civilization and proper behavior, perhaps you should explain to your own people why Earth accomplished in 3 weeks what your government failed to do in 20 years. And why it took humans to rescue Torvian citizens from slavers operating in sectors your fleet patrols regularly." The council chamber erupted in arguments and crosstalk, various representatives defending their positions or attacking others. And the carefully maintained facade of galactic unity cracked just enough to show the ugly truth beneath. Many species had simply accepted slavery and piracy as unavoidable problems rather than challenges requiring real solutions. The session ended without any formal sanctions being imposed on Earth, because too many council members quietly admired what humans had done, even if they couldn't say so publicly. And because the political calculus had shifted once footage of the rescued captives became public across the galaxy. Harrison recovered from his injuries in a military hospital on Europa Station, and he learned that the court-martial proceedings had been quietly dropped while his recommendations for promotion and commendation were being processed. And he suspected that Admiral Brooks had something to do with both outcomes. Lieutenant Nicole Stevens received recognition for her intelligence work that made the rescue possible, and her analytical methods were studied and adopted by other human intelligence services. Because the ability to track ships through the Corvin Nebula was just one example of how human ingenuity could overcome technological limitations. The Ricks suffered catastrophic losses from the operation, with their primary station destroyed and their reputation as untouchable slavers shattered beyond repair. And within months, their criminal empire began fragmenting as rivals moved to fill the power vacuum and former clients sought protection elsewhere. Commander Scarl stood trial in a human court, and his conviction on charges of kidnapping and slavery resulted in a sentence that would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. And he became a symbol within the galactic criminal underworld of what happened to those who underestimated human resolve. The word spread through the lawless sectors and pirate havens with remarkable speed, passed in whispers and encrypted messages between criminals who suddenly had to recalculate their risk assessments. Humans are off limits, especially their children, because the price for violating that rule is complete destruction. Lisa Martinez returned to her work on New Haven, but she also became an advocate for stronger protection of colonists throughout human space. And her testimony before Earth's government helped secure increased military presence in frontier sectors. Danny Martinez grew up with the dual burden of trauma and fame. The boy whose kidnapping had changed humanity's relationship with the galaxy. And he eventually became a counselor working with children who had experienced similar ordeals. Turning his pain into purpose, Captain Ryan Fletcher accepted a position training colonial security forces, sharing the hard-won lessons from the Vrix rescue with the next generation of people who would be responsible for protecting isolated human settlements. Megan Cooper's quick thinking and bravery during the captivity earned her recognition across human space, and she grew up to join the diplomatic corps, believing that the best way to prevent future kidnappings was to build relationships with alien species based on mutual respect rather than fear. The Galactic Council never formally apologized for their initial response to the Rix raid, but they did quietly increase enforcement against slave trading operations, and several species began coordinating with human military forces on joint operations against criminal organizations. Ambassador Hayes was reinstated to her position after a formal review that everyone understood was purely for appearance, and she continued to represent humanity with the same fierce determination that had shocked the Council. And she became known as someone who said what she meant and meant what she said. Relationship with the galaxy remained complicated, with some species viewing humans as dangerous cowboys who didn't respect established norms, while others saw them as the only species with enough courage to actually enforce the ideals that everyone else merely discussed in comfortable council chambers. The rescue operation became required study in human military academies, analyzed for its tactical innovations and strategic lessons, but also for what it revealed about the importance of moral clarity when